when the provincial government bought this lot over on Georgia Street, people thought they were crazy. It was so far from the center of the city that we'd never catch up to it. Well, by the time the building was finished in 1911, they had already started an annex on the building before it even opened. Newspaper after newspaper, day after day, new hotel, new big thing, new this, new that. It's almost this boosterism that's occurring. A lot of this, again, is outside investment. These big companies were being driven by investors from England who saw that Vancouver was in this prime position once the Panama Canal opened, that it would just take off. So we see things like this was actually not what was built exactly, but that's the original scheme for the Hotel Europe in Gastown. And you see that we're going from the buildings of the 1880s of maximum sort of 4 stories to all of a sudden we're going higher. So we have new technology now. With the Europe Hotel, it's actually reinforced concrete, but many of the other buildings were steel frame, like the Dominion building. And this is a really interesting photograph that shows, here's the steel frame building. You look at the building on the outside and it looks like a masonry solid building. Well, it's not. It's actually a veneer, terracotta and brick, and you see right there the veneer's already starting at that level, not at the ground and working up. So this has some implications when we talk about conservation of these buildings, how they're built, okay? We have to think about what the structure is, what the cladding is, how it's attached, how it's going to withstand seismic forces in an earthquake, gravity, weathering, many things we begin to have to think about. And I will point out, if you remember that picture of Hastings Street and the Rogers building, there it is right there. Little 3-story building right there. So from 1898 to 1908, 10 years, look at the difference in the type of building being built and in the scale of the building being built. Phenomenal, just complete change in attitude. 1912, as I mentioned, is the watershed year. It's the biggest projects going on, the most construction, the most building permits, the highest value of construction, and then it kind of gets that high and levels off and then drops the next year. But by that time period, we've seen so many of the buildings that we think of as heritage in Vancouver being built, all kind of clustering in around the 1909, 10, 11, 12 time period. Here's the construction shed for the Credit Foncier building as they're carving the granite capitals for it. Just a few images. Gastown at the time, you see there's still some wooden buildings left, but then the Leckie building is going up to the kind of massive volume that it does. And the large warehouses on the north side of Water Street are being constructed at that time. The Rogers building, the post office, Granville Street and Hastings, really becoming the commercial center. The Winch building, this is now Sinclair Center, and the Pemberton building, which are still there. That area hasn't actually surprisingly changed in appearance all that much. Sinclair Center, again, Hastings Street, this great infrastructure of the streetcars, which is now gone, but you can see here a lot of the character and detail of these buildings does remain. The Dominion building, of course, still a landmark on Hastings Street. What was the Vancouver World building at one point. So a number of these buildings down on Hastings Street, surprisingly enough, survived because the economy collapsed. So they didn't get rebuilt. That's a rather startling image of the West End from 1914. You'd be surprised to know that's the Sylvia Hotel, standing quite dominant, which it's kind of dwarfed now. Roberts School is in there, and then Grace Court, which is still there. We see a number of different traditions in Vancouver's buildings and in this part of the world. There was very much, there's no way around it. Most of our architects came from England and Scotland, and most of their clients were English and Scottish in derivation, or wanted to really fit in and be English. It was very much a British society at the time that had been transported to this part of the world, and especially in the Edwardian era when people were receiving so much investment in this area. So we see this influence of the British arts and crafts in many of our houses, and we see that it was partly a patriotic kind of appeal as well as showing your loyalty and showing good taste. But at that same time period, there was also a new style coming in which had been popularized in the United States in the early 1890s at the Columbia World Exposition, 1892 to 3, the Great White City, City Beautiful movement, Grant's Tomb in New York. All of these great public buildings were starting to be built not in a Victorian style, which we had seen before, but classical revival. It just flipped over right at that time period, and the influence had hit Vancouver by about 1899, 1900 at the very beginning. This really kind of dramatic move towards the symmetry and the use of classical columns. We see in our local buildings, this is the Hollies in Shaughnessy, adopting these design principles. We see a real shift then because of those other economic forces that I talked about. The First World War was devastating, not to our physical environment, but so many people that went away to war were killed or wounded. It had a staggering impact on our local economy and, of course, on our resource industries, and the post-war period was pretty grim. There was a slight recovery in the mid-1920s with the rising prices for grain, and of course grain was being shipped through Vancouver. That started to help. But really, it wasn't until the late 30s that we really saw much building construction again, and that was brief, and the post-war era is a whole other story. But we see, as we've moved forward through those time periods, that there's a whole new architectural sensibility that comes in, one that embraces the modern movement. We were slower in North America to embrace that. In Europe, there was so much devastation in the First World War that they readily embraced modernism as a new way to build. We held on to traditionalism much longer. We held on to our period revival styles and historical styles well through the 1920s and 30s until we started to see this kind of startling modernism show up in the late 30s and early 40s. There was a period in the late 1920s where again, with the rising grain prices, increased activity in the port, we saw a burst of economic prosperity characterized by a couple of really landmark buildings like the Marine Building, our great example of the Art Deco style, and really one of the great Art Deco buildings in Canada, arguably in North America, that epitomizes the new way of building. Now, Art Deco is not structurally innovative as modern architecture later became. It's the same kind of structure as the Dominion Building in many ways, but it's certainly a new style, and one of the key things about it is it's not like an Edwardian building that comes up and has a great big overhanging cornice on it, as in the classical revival style. Rather, as it rises, it sheds weight, it becomes lighter, and emphasizes that verticality, similar to, and it's often called the invisible Gothic, similar to Gothic cathedrals that shed weight and rise and point towards heaven. These new skyscrapers were pointing towards the sky. We see in the streamlined modern style a later variation that begins to show up during the Depression. People couldn't afford to build with great luxurious materials in the Art Deco style anymore. It became much more a European-derived modernism that is clean, planar, and derives its strength and power from its geometry, very simple geometry. And my last slide, just showing how I love this shot by Leonard Frank, which is a collage of Vancouver and Victoria buildings from the 20s and 30s that shows how our cities were now developing and densifying and really beginning to take on a more urban character, which they had really previously not had. And the type of buildings that we begin to see built at that time period, the Royal Bank, St. Paul's Hospital, Stock Exchange Building, Vancouver City Hall, Medical Dental, Hudson's Bay from a little earlier. The buildings that we have inherited from the past that we now feel very strongly about conserving to tell us about our previous history. There, I did that without taking a breath. Thanks.